I work for California Heritage Indigenous Research Project, Nishinanam Menem Ni, or I am not Nisenan, and I am honored to get to do work with CHIRP. I'm in a very lucky position. And also honored to introduce our next presenter, Jordan Reznick. Super stoked to have Jordan here. He is a GRI NEH postdoctoral fellow at the Getty Research Institute and will join Grinnell College as assistant professor of American Studies in the fall. Their current research project, Landing the Camera, Indigenous Ecologies and Photographic Technologies in the West, describes how indigenous ecological science shaped 19th century landscape photographs in California. Reznick's publications include Through the Guillotine Mirror, Claude Cahun's Photographic Theory of Trans Against the Void in Art Journal in 2022, and Indigenous Space, Haudenosaunee Sky World and the Territories of American Art, which is forthcoming in American Art this year. It's my pleasure to have Jordan come onto the stage. Welcome, Jordan.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you. Just let me get my setup. Okay, I'm ready. Great. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you for that introduction, Ember, and thank you for the invitation to be a part of this Building a Framework for Truth. It is really means so much to me to be invited here. And also, thank you to all of you from the Nevada City Rancheria Tribe here and online, and it's just such a privilege to be able to be a guest here on your beautiful land. Thank you. I also want to give a content warning that I will be discussing violence against Indigenous peoples in general, and there are also going to be 2 specific instances of violence, and I will give another content warning a couple minutes before each of those. So that's coming up. So my research reevaluates 19th century California landscape photographs from the standpoint of indigenous history and ecological science. When white American landscape photographers pictured California land as an uninhabited frontier suited to the advancement of US settlement, they also recorded an indigenous space, a place of intergenerational relationships between California Indians and their homelands, relationships that were torn asunder but not ended by settler colonization. I am myself a 3rd-generation settler colonizer of California, descended from 14 generations of British colonizers and 3 generations of Eastern European Jewish colonizers. So I just want to take a moment to discuss my relationship to this research and to the notion of building a framework for truth. So those of you here that, like me, are non-Indigenous people who grew up in California, you know that we did not learn the truth about Indigenous histories, Indigenous presence, Indigenous worldviews, and the genocide that our ancestors committed. And I'm so grateful that you're here to learn and to support the tribal peoples today. But because I'm a photo historian, I think a lot about the relationship between the visual and truth. And so when I started to really internalize that truth, I started to see that the land around me is indigenous land everywhere, whether we're in the forest, whether we're looking at the countryside or the city. But I also realized that I could only abstractly understand this idea that the land that I saw was native land. And I actually, so I could see through the kind of mythologies of the settlement that taught me to see it as naturally American land. but I couldn't quite actually discern what visual aspects of the land connected it to Native histories and Native worldviews. And so this research really began with me wanting to learn those histories so that I could change my own perception. And so I'm inviting you to join me in that process today. And I still also have so much to learn, especially from the Nisenan community here, and I hope to have the privilege to have those conversations. So I'm interested in how the history of California landscape photography might be revised by considering the Native perspective of California history, which began during time immemorial when creators made the diverse indigenous peoples of California in conjunction with each of their homelands, each responsible for the well-being of the other. By the late 18th century, when Spanish colonizers came to the California coast, an estimated 2 million indigenous peoples speaking more than 100 languages lived in present-day California. And they had for millennia refined their innovations in technology, industry, science, philosophy, architecture, and the arts, each stemming from the perspective that land is alive and that each entity of the more than human world is due the respect of a beloved family member with its own sovereign personhood. Current research in California ecology reveals that despite colonial discovery myths of an untamed wilderness, California was a manicured environment shaped over the course of tens of thousands of generations of genetic modification, plant dispersal, habitat construction, and other deliberate ecological practices reflecting a respect for life that remains unmatched in the non-Indigenous world. Photography, by comparison, is a relatively new technology. It was not even invented yet when native life in California was turned upside down by Spanish Catholics who enslaved, starved, and murdered California Indians at their missions. As such, there is no photographic record of that violence. Photography was invented only 9 years prior to the American settler occupation of California that began following the Mexican-American War in 1848 and intensified with the discovery of gold that year and continues today. Accordingly, photographers were numerous among the first invaders of California. Of the more than 92,000 non-Indigenous people listed on the California census in 1850, 1 in every 100 was a photographer, which is a high percentage considering the specialized training, equipment, and materials that had to be acquired from New York. Photographs were the prized form of visual communication between the West and East Coasts because they seemed to confirm that these outrageous stories of California's natural bounty were actual fact. As such, photographs shaped many aspects of California's colonization. Photographs of gold quickened the pace of white emigration. Beautiful landscapes stimulated tourism. Systematic views assessed the value of land parcels. And pictures of plump fruits lured white farmers to purchase land. Nearly 1 million settlers arrived within only 3 decades. As Benjamin Madley will discuss later, in contrast, these years witnessed the most tremendous loss of indigenous land and rights in the nation's history. Under US occupation, indigenous communities were subjected to genocidal violence, enslavement, child separation, sexual assault, dispossession, and discriminatory legislation. Their towns, food storage, homelands, and rivers were rapidly and purposely decimated, making it impossible for them to live, harvest, hunt, and fish as they had for millennia. In contrast to the 1 million new white residents of California, by the end of the 1870s, only 30,000 California Indians remained alive, an 80% loss in 25 years. So I just want to pause there for us to really feel and recognize the gravity of that loss. 80% of everyone you know in the span of 1 generation. And just all of those empty seats that are here today, just think of all of the people that are not here with us today as a result. It's really a loss for all of us. So, despite the immensity of this loss, California's photographic archives contains almost no trace of genocide. Instead, we have empty landscapes, ethnographic photographs, and proud miners. And I'm going to give a content warning for, in a couple of minutes, there'll be another discussion of violence. Photographs are typically associated with visual facts, but California landscape photographs were not just about presenting facts. They also concealed facts, the facts of land theft and genocide, of indigenous presence and indigenous knowledge. Those facts are hidden by the visual association of California landscape photographs with America's manifest destiny myth, that the bounty of California's natural resources was evidence that God had created the land as a promised land for the West as a promised land for whites. To search photography for evidence of indigenous histories and sciences, I examine what photo historian Jean-Michel Smith calls the photograph's edge of sight. Smith points out that as much as photographs preserve a record of the visible surface of the world, in so doing, they also betray their technical failure to make aspects of the world visible. Smith writes that photographs supply a revelation of an unseen world that photography does not fully disclose, but makes us aware of in its invisibility. In other words, there are limits to what a photograph can record, and when the photograph betrays its limitations, the invisible becomes an alternate photographic subject, troubling the scene. For example, this photograph points decidedly toward what cannot be seen. Robert H. Vance, the first photographer to document California gold mines, chose, fittingly for his first in his series, an image of Sutter's Mill. The gold rush famously began here when James Marshall and his Nisenan employees found gold on Nisenan land on the South Fork of the American River. Though the original daguerreotype was lost, Vance made another, which was also lost. This copy made by Carlton Watkins of the second lost daguerreotype recovers that loss only partially. For by seeing it, a viewer becomes aware of the unseen daguerreotypes. This is particularly so because daguerreotypes, which were the first kind of photograph invented, were infinitely sharp. So you could zoom in and zoom in and zoom in with a magnifying glass, and there would be no grain or loss of detail at all. So here we have decidedly less detail. So the lost details become a subject of inquiry as one questions the absences in blocks and blurs of shadow and highlight. Even more importantly, nothing of gold's discovery is actually visible here. Instead, Marshall and a sawmill stand in as visual proxy for an event 6 years prior. With all of photography's ability to freeze time, capturing a moment past is a temporal task that the medium simply cannot accomplish. In place of historical facts, photography lends a sense of reality to symbols. Here, the real of a place and person from which the gold rush commenced become surrogates for California's colonial birth. Both real place and symbol of origins, Sutter's Mill is also the site from which commenced the extrajudicial mass killings of the Nisenan and other California Indians. As Madley meticulously documents in his book, American Genocide, in February 1849, a white mob followed a group of Nisenan to their village, seeking revenge for an embellished crime. They kidnapped 200 to 300 people and brought them here. And after a mock trial, 30 were murdered and the rest released. So again, I want to pause and honor the terror and pain that Nisenan families experienced that day. According to Madley, this massacre marked the beginning of whites' expressed intention to exterminate all California Indians. From this symbolic site originated the new law of the land, becoming a make-believe courthouse for, quote, frontier justice. Though that history is as invisible as gold's discovery, the photograph's significance might be revised, for it is the fact that this place was imagined as a symbol which ripened it as a site from which a very real genocide commenced. Our very own Shelley Covert points our attention to the symbolism of the sawmill for Nisenan peoples. The sawmill was a harbinger of genocide in Nisenan territory. Whenever a mill appeared, it was soon followed by mines and clear cuts, as well as the saloon and the brothel, places linked to genocidal and sexual violence against the Nisenan. What else of the indigenous world is invisible? Had we the original daguerreotypes, could we zoom in and find traces of the chilling events? Certainly, the families of the murdered returned afterwards to care for their departed kin with a proper ceremony. Did they leave any memorial relics? Was this once a footpath to the roundhouse of the Nisenan town of Coloma? Did the reproduction fail to copy evidence that a Nisenan family once tended this hill by burning it annually, sowing grass seeds, harvesting wild oats, and picking dandelion greens to steam in their oven? It is beyond photography's temporal limits to record the thousands of generations of care for this land since time immemorial. The meaning we make, though, of this photograph is a matter of two perceptions that converge and overlap here at this nexus between what is visible and what is not visible. Depending on whether a viewer is primed to see this scene from an indigenous or a settler-centered perspective, or both, a viewer will search for or even assume different details in what is not visible here. A world ending or a world beginning, or both. So content warning, again, here for the second discussion of violence coming up in a couple minutes. Tonawanda Seneca scholar Mishwana Goman writes that the real of settler colonial society is built on the violent erasures of alternative modes of mapping and geographic understandings. I would add that, like maps, photographs also play part in this erasure. They lend a sense of reality to settler accounts of history and place, repressing perceptions of indigenous space. However, indigenous histories of place continue alongside colonial histories, and I believe that a native history of photography that pictures land as indigenous land persists within this colonial history of photography. So to explore this, I want to turn to the history of Native basket weavers for an alternative view of the landscape photographs that were central to the colonization of what is now Yosemite National Park. I ask, as photographers adapted their new and imperfect medium to California's advanced ecological spaces, did they unwittingly picture Yosemite as an indigenous place? And I want to pause for a moment and just clarify the tribal names that I'll be using. So I'll use Awanichi to refer to the native peoples of Yosemite around the time of colonial contact, and they are the indigenous peoples who have called Yosemite home since time immemorial. But that name is not today in use by the descendants of the Awanichi, who today identify as the 7 tribes of Yosemite. So when talking about individuals or contemporary people, I'll use their specific tribal affiliations. This pair of photographs made in 1950 of Southern Sierra Miwok and Mono Lake Kutzaduka basket weaver Lucy Tullis, she sits behind the Yosemite Museum, where she was employed to demonstrate basket making. Without the aid of her eyes, Tullis manipulates her warp, weft, and awl rhythmically, showing the depth of her familiarity with techniques refined over countless generations. Her granddaughter-in-law, Kashaya Pomo basket weaver Dr. Julia Parker, would later recall what Tullis taught her about what life used to be here in this exact spot where Tullis sits, which is where the Awani village, the largest native town in the Yosemite Valley, once resided. Tullis told her the kids would be playing over here, The men would be over on the other side making their tools. Some of the ladies would be sitting on that rock pounding their acorn meal, and some of the other ladies would be over with the kids telling stories and playing games. We can imagine the hush that descended on that scene a century prior in March 1851 when 518 militiamen invaded the Yosemite Valley. At the time, Tellis's mother, Louisa Tom, was a young child, and she never forgot hiding in a cave while invaders burned her village and murdered and imprisoned her relatives. So again, I want to pause and take time to empathize with that terror and loss that Louisa Tom and her family experienced that day. Afterwards, Tom and other survivors refused to leave their homeland and instead remained as laborers in the occupying settlement. The women labored as domestic workers in the non-Indigenous tourist industry, but they also continued to make baskets. Baskets had already for centuries been a major Native women-led manufacturing industry in California, producing all things that support human life, from cradles to caskets, cooking pots, fishing nets, sports equipment. After colonization, Native Yosemite women reinvented the medium to supplement their incomes, gain social standing, maintain cultural pedagogies, and stimulate cultural pride. But they also used it to secure a place for Native peoples in the valley by proving their value to the park as a source of revenue and publicity. By the mid-20th century, the National Park Service's anti-Indigenous rules and red tape had replaced the killing militias of the 19th century, but their attempts to evict Indigenous peoples were no less vigorous. So when Park Service photographer Ralph Anderson made this image, the Park Service was in the process of naturalizing the predicted outcome of their measures with vanishing race myths in promotional park literature. They described Tellis as, quote, the last of the basket makers in the valley, end quote, explaining that she would soon die and claiming erroneously that there were no youth to carry on her legacy. In fact, Parker recently retired in 2015 after 58 years working in this exact same spot as one of the park's longest ever employees. And today, Southern Sierra Miwok Ranger Emily Dayhoff educates visitors about Native history in this same place. The photograph on the right indicates Anderson's ethnographic intent. Tellis, with a seriousness deemed appropriate for a person who might be the last of her kind, faces basket and body squarely to the camera. Anderson selects a moment in a composition that fixes his subject temporally outside of modernity, as if post-war era tourist culture were not bustling everywhere around the edge of the frame. He also hopes to naturalize indigeneity as something disappearing. Like the Park Service's frustrated efforts, however, Anderson's photograph fails at its goal. He has made a mistake that spoils the photograph. Though his exposure is technically accurate, the harsh shadows on her face obstruct the view, making it unlikely that this photograph will reproduce well in promotional literature. The photograph on the left does no better. This time, he lets in more light to dampen the harsh shadows and to shallow the focal plane to wash the native architecture behind Tellis into a sentimental blur. However, not accounting for Tellis's weaving, he selects a shutter speed too slow to freeze the motion. As her hands blur with motion, the willow weft undulates, tearing through the edge of the frame like a beam of light, rendering the photograph equally unusable for the Park Service. Her decision to keep weaving during the making of the photograph reflects the constant choices Native women made under the constant surveillance of a non-Native gaze, calculating one's outward performance of Indianness against the long view strategies of resistance and resurgence that would secure future Indigenous life in the valley. Conscious or not, Tellis's choice to weave under the camera's gaze reflects her priority, her basket. If Anderson's camera is synced to a temporality that anticipates Indigenous extinction, Tellis's fingers are in contrast synced to that of vibrant Indigenous futures. Her hands are not only too fast for the photograph, but they work on a time frame that is too slow, so long, intergenerational, and strategic that it cannot be apprehended in frozen slices of time. Thousands of years of ecological science aimed at sustaining life in Yosemite Valley accumulate in every basket. That temporality appears here in a gesture that refuses colonization's death-dealing power with new techniques, aesthetics, and ecological practices that anticipate indigenous futures, all while navigating Anderson's patronizing gaze. There's also a submerged perspective here. Tellis hints at something that the viewer cannot see, which appears in the humor that spreads from a glint in her eye across the creases of her now unshaded face. Her smile is likely a practiced, polite response to the controlling surveillance of park officials and the constant buzz of tourists snapping pictures. Elders like Tellis counteracted the degrading fictions of indigeneity they had to perform to avoid eviction by also revitalizing indigenous knowledge and ceremonies to strengthen the youth's sense of connection to their homelands. Her smile seems to make Anderson the subject of a patronizing gaze. Like a gracious hostess to a rude guest, she refuses the somber vanishing race fantasy, suggesting that it is she that anticipates a future when the last of his kind finally departs. The gesture is small, but Mohawk anthropologist Audra Simpson describes such refusals as everyday acts with which indigenous peoples reject the legitimacy of an occupying government and keep steadfast to a native view of history and future, even while doing what one must to survive. Tellis's twinkling return of the ethnographic gaze is a marker of her refusal to disappear. Ethnographic photographs should be understood together with landscape photographs as two sides of the same coin. Environmental historian Mark Spence argues that uninhabited wilderness had to be created before it could be preserved. The creation of national parks and forced removal of indigenous peoples were interconnected. 19th century landscape photographs aimed to assuage white Americans' anxieties about the loss of the natural world at the hands of commerce. These romantic landscapes encouraged a sentimental vision of nature as ancient places worthy of preservation. Meanwhile, salvage ethnographic images paradoxically proposed that whites were preserving for science a record of, quote, a vanishing race. These images aimed to assuage the anxiety of guilt by concealing the facts of genocidal violence and presenting annihilation as part of an inevitable natural process. Together, these two genres of images obscured the constitutive relationship between indigenous peoples and the pictured landscapes, that of stewards with rightful title to their homelands. To that end, as Tuscarora art historian Jolene Rickard writes, photographs of the West not only facilitated land theft and violence, but also sabotaged the ecological knowledge necessary to sustain life on the planet. Photographs like these of park-like montane meadows cradled by spectacular rock formations were some of Carlton Watkins' 1861 photographs of Yosemite that are believed to have influenced Congress to pass the 1864 legislation to preserve Yosemite from commercial development. This story is often repeated in the history of photography because it suggests that landscape photography acted as a political agent for nature conservation and in that way inaugurated many of the ideas that we still have today about landscape photography and environmentalism. As many scholars have detailed, whites believed Yosemite to be a kind of spiritual promised land that confirmed the virtues of US westward expansion. These photographs, commissioned by James Mason Hutchings to promote tourism to his newly completed hotel, seem to confirm this fiction by employing Western aesthetic traditions of beauty and sublimity. Because Watkins' previous work surveying for the mining industry, had facilitated the destruction of land, photographing Yosemite posed an aesthetic challenge and a technological challenge to differentiate between landscapes that should be preserved and those that should be marked for destruction. His success depended on painstaking techniques designed to overcome the limitations of his technology. And for this 1861 trip, he was equipped with a newly invented globe lens that was wide enough for landscapes, a custom-built mammoth camera that produced 18 by 22-inch negatives, which are very large, to be able to make frameable artworks instead of the then popular album prints, and wet plate collodion photochemistry with which he would make albumin prints that had a greater tonal and chromatic range than his earlier salt prints. Watkins' technological advancements and his exposure techniques aimed to increase the realism of his images, while his compositional strategies aimed at producing a sense of wonder. His goals required a constant balancing act between exposure and composition. For example, the harmonious compositional balance that appears here between the verdant life of the valley floor and the sublime rock formations that tower above it is also a calculated balance of exposure time. Knowing the limitation of his lens and his chemistries, to see through the atmospheric haze that is invisible to the human eye, he had to intentionally underexpose the foreground, shortening his exposure time in the hopes that the mountains in the background might appear more real than dreamy apparitions. Knowing that even this shortened exposure time would still be so long that if there was even a slight breeze, it would make an unsightly mess of the trees and the shrubs and the grasses in the foreground, he also photographed before dawn when the air is the most still. And he may have succeeded in portraying a wondrous Eden to his white viewers, but to Awanichi viewers of the time, this scene would have been visibly marked by recent violence. This meadow is the former location of Halasia, one of the villages militiamen burned to the ground during the 1851 invasions. 10 years prior, the smoke from fires of at least 9 other villages would have been visible rising behind the line of trees, particularly from the large village of Loya at the foot of Sentinel Rock. Maria Librado Iderte, who grew up in Loya and was 12 years old during the invasions, would have recognized here the vacant sites of neighbors' homes left suddenly and destroyed by settlers. In contrast to the awe that's typically associated with Watkins' photographs, Iderte's perspective more accurately associates this view with the affect of terror, loss, and grief. To indigenous viewers, it was also Awanichi ecological science rather than Western landscape aesthetics that guided the layout of this scene. Silver sagebrush and fiddleneck spread across the wide meadow in the foreground, and they are bordered by a curated selection of black oaks, ponderosa pines, and white fir. The tidy organization of plant life reveals that Yosemite was no uninhabited wilderness, but a cultural landscape whose biodiversity resulted from thousands of years of research-based advancements in ecological science aimed at providing a comfortable life at this isolated high elevation location. To fully grasp a native Yosemite visual perspective, however, a viewer must also look intimately at the ground. When artist and writer Deborah Valoma walks with Julia Parker through Yosemite, Parker narrates for her what she sees, but she does so with her head tilted downwards, pointing to plants, explaining how they grow, when to harvest them, and how to use them. Even when driving, she asks Valoma to pull over the car to point out a particular red bud with which she makes her baskets, or a favorite fern, calling out, "Oh, there's that fern, I think that's it, I'm looking for that maidenhair fern." When she refers to a plant, she often refers not just to the type of plant, but to the exact plant with whom she has a relationship. The plants that appear here, too, must be understood as identifiable members of the interspecies community of the valley. The silver sagebrush and fiddleneck were likely cultivated for their medicinal qualities and their culinary roughage. Annual burning kept them segregated as discrete patches that could be harvested one at a time. Now overgrown, they encroach upon one another. Burning also stimulated germination, suppressed diseases, cleared the view for hunters, and kept small trees and shrubs from sapping the sunlight and the groundwater of the meadow. In 1929, Iderte complained that the valley had become, quote, too bushy, explaining that it had once been as open and manicured as an American football field. She was judging the valley's state, by a Southern Sierra Miwok aesthetic, grounded in the findings of ecological research. It also appears that despite Watkins' careful exposure balance, what at first seemed to be slight aesthetic mistakes at the edge of sight reveal what the Southern Sierra Miwok would have recognized as ecological distress. For instance, by underexposing the photograph to make the mountains appear more substantial, Watkins darkened the tangle of trees, losing detail in parts of the print. The deep shadows emphasize the thickness of unharvested and unburned saplings who trespass on the meadow, piercing that darkness are striking white scares of dead branches and tree carcasses, so bright that no detail appears in these highlights either. This trash, as indigenous people referred to intended plant detritus, was a signal that Yosemite was desperately in need of rejuvenating human disturbances. Here, the trash punctures the photographic record, bookending the tonal range of the print, creating areas of invisibility at the highlight and the shadow ends. And these visual aberrations counter the colonial notion that conserving nature by leaving it untouched counter the colonial notion of conserving nature by leaving it untouched with evidence that only 10 years after colonization, forbidding indigenous ecological practices was already turning catastrophic. Basketry materials growing in the meadow also register their peril in a refusal to be recorded. Despite the stillness of the pre-dawn air, Watkins' success was diminished by the deer brush and black oaks, both plants that are engineered by basket weavers to grow long, strong, flexible stalks, accounting for their uncontainable sway. The shape of the blur also reveals how the deer brush have become branched and bushy from lack of care. As for the oaks, it's best to cut them as tender sapling sprouts to make the ribs for baskets, fishing cages, hunting traps, and the hoops for field games. The extent of overgrowth in this scene measures the number of years since this particular meadow thrived at the center of an indigenous world full of work, meals, and play, where plants were respected members of the community. The meadow's distress lays to rest the symbolism of a virtuous fit between American settlers and Yosemite. Not so successful after all, as a beacon of manifest destiny, the closer we look, the more clearly we see that this is native land. A motion blur is a visual phenomenon peculiar to modern mechanical optics of photography. For Watkins, it is a blemish, not just because it's a smear of invisibility, but because it indicates that this scene belongs to modernity rather than the ancient nature of a promised land Eden. Destroying that illusion, the waving deer brush and oaks reveal what photographs necessarily picture. They are never timeless, but instead always specific moments of time, and so situated within very particular histories from which they emerge. In this case, the segment of time betrayed by this blur is an exact span of moments lived in the Halasia meadow, once tended and now untended. It appears exactly as it does because of specific intergenerational, interspecies relationships between these plants and their Awanichi relatives, as well as settlers' disruption of those relationships. In that sense, the blurred area of photographic invisibility is indeed a time span the photograph cannot capture, but whose reality it indicates in that invisibility. The enduring temporal scale of indigenous ecological science and the lifeways capable of maintaining Yosemite's vitality. Goman encourages us to think about indigenous space as the product of interrelationships. That blur connects this slice of time to the interrelationships that give life to this meadow as indigenous space. Whether or not women ever returned to that particular deer brush, women did continue to tend basketry materials in Yosemite. This map, which I've altered somewhat to protect sensitive information, gives you a sense of the at least 37 villages known to have existed during the 1851 invasion. During Watkins' 1861 summer trip, at least 4 of those villages remained active. At Mirror Lake, women harvested bracken fern roots to invent new black designs for their baskets. Parker herself, somehow I got, here we go. Here's Mirror Lake. Okay, here we go. Parker herself learned to harvest bracken fern roots here a century later. We also know from the account of a traveler with Watkins' group that a village at Yosemite Falls was plainly visible from the settler campground. Though Watkins omitted villages from his photographs, you'll recognize the signs of ecological distress here: dead branches, tall grasses, the dense undergrowth. And we witness a similar scene here near the Royal Arches, which was a winter shelter for thousands of years. In contrast, a summer village remained visible near Three Brothers. Notice that, so Watkins clearly hid these umacha behind trees, and it's likely that there were more behind these other dense trees that we can't see as well. But also notice how this meadow appears more cared for than the others. The grasses are shorter, there's less trash accumulated under the understory. Native communities sometimes managed to start villages when settlers had vacated the valley, and the following year, in 1862, a traveler noted seeing fires set at this village in the fall. This barely visible village counters the colonial origin story that the history of Yosemite began with these photographs winning congressional support to make Yosemite a quintessentially American place. Instead, we see that indigenous time has not yet passed, that the indigenous world of the valley persists. As indigenous space, these places remain what Goman calls indigenous sites of possibility from which indigenous stories continued to and still continue to unfold. The absences, aberrations, and intimate details in these photographs hold the material imprint of indigenous relationships with these specific places to prove that Yosemite and all of California was, is, and will remain indigenous land. Perceiving this as indigenous space discloses a concealed history of photography within the images that advance colonization, one that testifies to the theft of land, to genocide, to native knowledge, to native presence, and native resurgence. Thank you. Thank you.
Awesome.